Warriors Don't Cry, Chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5. Dear Diary, the 2 days since I first went to Central felt like I was living in some stranger's life. Today, I won't think of integration. I won't think of Central High, and I won't think of the white people. I will spend the whole day finding the perfect disguise to wear to the wrestling matches. No matter what, I'm going to be a regular person. I'm going to have my usual date with Grandma and my secret pretend date with Vince at the matches. As hard as I tried not to care, I couldn't start my morning without knowing what the governor, his National Guard, and the school board were up to. I had to face the awful truth. Grandma was right. I was letting those people determine how I felt and how I lived a great part of my day. I brushed my hair back into a ponytail and headed for the front porch. As I picked up the newspaper, headlines leapt out at me. Halton Integration asks, Board seeks suspension of U.S. order. The Little Rock School Board was asking Judge Davies to suspend temporarily the plan for integrating Central High. He would be holding a hearing on their petition on Friday, September 6th, today. As I read on, I saw the good news. Ike says he will use the law, tells Faubus, cooperate with us. The federal Constitution will be upheld by every legal means at my command, President Eisenhower had told Governor Faubus. The president had sent a telegram to Governor Faubus saying he was sure the governor, the National Guard, and other state officials would give full cooperation to the United States Supreme Court. The president also reassured the governor that rumors of federal authorities waiting to arrest him were untrue. I think the school board's backing off having the integration, I told my mother as she prepared to leave for school. Please stop here and answer question 1. Be patient, Mother said, heading toward the car. By the way, I'm counting on you to give your grandmother extra special help today. She's a bit weary. Oh, no. I especially didn't want Grandma India to be weary. I was counting on her to take me to the wrestling matches. For the rest of the day, I devoted myself to doing more than my share of the chores. I would do anything to keep her able-bodied and fit. As Saturday morning turned into afternoon, I was busy keeping to myself so I could apply my grown-up makeup. It was an art I had not yet acquired, since I wasn't allowed to wear makeup. Even by the 3rd try, I resembled a circus clown. But as I looked in the mirror for a final check, I was proud of the job I had done. I was a new person. Promptly at 5, Grandma breezed into the front hall. She was dressed in church-going clothes, her ladies' day outfit, a blue suit with a matching hat that swooped down from its mischievous perch on the side of her head. Well, don't just stand there, child. Help me find my parasol. I couldn't help smiling. The frantic search for the umbrella was a familiar scene. It made me feel that at least some part of my life was left intact. We'd better go without it, I said. We were running late, and if we didn't hurry, the bus would leave us behind. I had been patiently waiting, hoping that at any moment my grandmother would signal her approval of my grown-up outfit, upswept hairdo, and high-heeled black patent shoes. Layers of forbidden makeup and dark glasses completed what I thought was the perfect disguise. The white people would never, ever recognize me from any picture they might have seen. Of course, my one big worry was that Grandma might say I was too grown up, but she only peered at me with a strange and lingering expression. Let's go, Grandma, we're going to be late, I said, trying to coax her toward the front door. I was praying Vince wouldn't grow impatient waiting for me and leave, or worse yet, allow himself to be talked into spending the evening with one of the other girls. Why don't you take a seat? I'll be back in a moment, Grandma said, sounding quite strange, beckoning me to remain there in the hallway at the door. As I heard her and Grandma whisper in the other room, as I settled into a chair, I thought about the earlier times we had gone together to the wrestling matches. Those matches were big events in my life because we traveled downtown to the Robinson Auditorium, a place usually reserved for white people only. Those were the times when I got to go outside of my neighborhood, outside the world where I spent most of my life. We sat in the same room with white folks, able to observe them up close. I wanted to get to know them better, to see what it was they had that put them in charge. Grandma India would adjust her hat, and then we would both strut down the aisle to the seats that her friend Mr. Claxton had saved for us. He would always be there waiting for us, with the best balcony seats our people were allowed to have. After we got settled, I would complain about my thirst, and Grandma would grant permission for a trip to the soft drink stand. There I would meet Vince, as we'd planned, and take him to join Grandma and Mr. Claxon, explaining that our meeting had been accidental. I'd enjoyed 8 evenings of double dating with Grandma and Vince, and she didn't even realize it. I knew full well my family would never have allowed me to date. They had said that all along, that when I was 18 and going to college I could go out with boys, and then only in the company of a chaperone. As the evening wore on and the matches got really heated, Grandma Indy and I would behave as we behaved nowhere else. She would pound the floor with her parasol and shout and wave her fist until her hat was twisted on her head and her church-going outfit was rumpled. Once she had even dropped her glasses and broken them in a fit of rage when her tag team favorites Mud Mountain and Blue Moon Hog were counted out by the referee. When it was all over, she would revert to her quietest and most cultured tones, speaking barely above a whisper. Magnificent, child. That's the way a body gets rid of aggression without misbehaving. Now, Melba, straighten yourself up, honey. Time to present ourselves as the ladies we are. Please stop here and answer question 2. Sorry, child. You can't go with me to the matches. Not tonight, said Grandma, grabbing me from my happy recollections. Maybe next time, when the integration settles down. But why not? I felt tears coming, but I had promised Grandma I wouldn't cry. It's just too dangerous for you to go out there amongst all those white people. They'll never recognize me. See? I twirled around to show her that I really was a new person. Grandma India moved closer to me and cupped my face in her hands. You're staying home, baby. It's for your own good. Everything's being taken from me, I cried. Your grandmother's right, honey. Mother Lois put her arm around my waist, trying to convince me it was not the end of the world. Suppose one of those people who saw us at Central recognizes you and tries to pick a fight. What about the risk to your grandmother? I'll never go back to Central. I ran from the room and locked my bedroom door, burying my face in the pillow so no one could hear me cry. Later, I wrote in my diary, freedom is not integration. Freedom is being able to go with Grandma to the wrestling matches. Please stop here and answer question 3. The next day in the Sunday paper, I saw a pitiful close-up photo of Elizabeth walking alone in front of Central on that first day of integration. It pained my insides to see, once again, the twisted, scowling white faces with open mouths jeering, clustered about my friend's head like bouquets of grotesque flowers. It was an ad paid for by a white man from a small town in Arkansas. If you live in Arkansas, the ad read, study this picture, no shame. When hate is unleashed and bigotry finds a voice, God help us all. I felt a kind of joy and hope in the thought that one white man was willing to use his own money to call attention to the injustice we were facing. Maybe the picture would help others realize what they were doing was hurting everybody. Seeing the ad was the beginning of a wonderful Sunday. Just before church started, Vince walked right up and said to me flat out, I want you to be my girlfriend. Girlfriend? I repeated the word, desperately groping to find just the right response. I'd never been asked before. As the sermon began, I felt guilty that I didn't have my mind on prayer. Instead, I was wondering whether Vince would give me a friendship ring or the letter from his sweater. It pushed all thoughts of Central, High, Governor Faubus, and integration into the back of my mind. The minister was urging us to pray for Governor Faubus and do whatever was necessary to heal any sour feelings we had against white people. He had been organizing other ministers in Little Rock to speak out and condemn the governor for dispatching the troops. He said we should pray for the judges and city's officials and the president to make the right decision, to let us into Central High. Suddenly my attention was drawn to what the prayer ladies were saying. They were calling my name, asking God to protect me when I walked into the lion's den at Central. I remember what Grandma had said. Church is the life's blood of our folks' community. I knew very well that without the church and the help of the people sitting around me, I had little chance of making it through the school year. Certainly, I couldn't count on the police. If I got into trouble and really needed protection, it would probably be the network of phone calls initiated by Reverend Young that would set off a rescue and construct a web of safety. U.S. Court summons served on Governor. Arkansas Gazette, Wednesday, September 11th, 1957. A week after our first attempt to get into Central, I was still rushing to get each morning's newspaper to read about the people who gathered daily in front of the school to see that we didn't get in. The president had agreed to give the governor a 10-day respite to sort out his response to the court order. There would be a meeting at Eisenhower's vacation spot in Rhode Island after that. The next day we learned that Representative Brooke Hayes would go with Governor Faubus to a 5-man conference that included the president, Attorney General Herbert Brownell, Jr., and Sherman Adams, Chief White House Assistant. On September 15th, the Arkansas Gazette headlines read, Faubus asking compromise. Ike refuses. Commitment. Status of troops still unanswered. Realizing that the dilemma of integration wasn't going to be resolved quickly, everybody seemed to be concerned about our falling behind in our schoolwork. Teachers from our community, along with other professionals, were offering to give us books and to tutor us. Grace Lorch, who had helped Elizabeth escape the mob, and her husband Dr. Lorch, organized tutoring sessions. It felt good to dress in school clothes and go to Philander Smith, our community's college. For part of each day, I studied schoolwork and spent time with my 8 friends, enjoying a thimbleful of normality. Being together in those classes, the 9 of us were developing a true friendship, becoming closer knit than we might have been under other circumstances. We talked about our fears, what we missed at our old school, and our hopes that the integration issues would soon be resolved. While I regretted the friendships I was losing, I treasured the growing ties to the 8. Just before the court hearing where Governor Faubus would be called to account, the 9 of us were summoned to Mrs. Bates's house to meet with the press. Nothing had changed since our last meeting. The troops were still in place around the school, and every morning the crowd of segregationists grew larger. Governor Faubus was still predicting violence. Several very dignified and important-looking men sat in her living room. One was the NAACP attorney, Wiley Branton. I recognized another man whose picture I'd seen in the newspapers, the famous lawyer Thurgood Marshall, the man who had delivered the argument that resulted in the Supreme Court's 1954 school integration ruling. Judging by my father's height, I figured Mr. Marshall was more than 6 feet tall, with a commanding presence, fair skin, and brown hair and a mustache. He spoke like somebody on television, his sharp, quick New York accent overlaying a slight southern drawl. At the same time, we were petitioning for a court order to force your governor to move his troops away from Central's front doors. We'll be planning other options. Meanwhile, we are asking that you be patient. Justice will prevail. He spoke confidently, in a way that made me feel that I deserved to be admitted to Central High. I looked at this man who seemed to have none of the fears and hesitation of my parents or the other adults around us. Instead, he had a self-assured air about him, as though he had seen the promised land and knew for certain we would get there. We had only heard rumors of freedom, but he had lived it, and it showed in his every word, his every movement, in the way he sat tall in his seat. He urged us to prepare ourselves to testify in federal court if need be. Right then and there, I began to fret about the truth. I couldn't tell. If I testified in court about what really happened to me, it would get printed in the newspapers and those men would come after us again. But now I knew that, worst of all, it would give the governor yet another excuse to keep us out of school. The very basis of his argument against our integrating was that it would cause so much violence that blood would run in the streets. If I told the judge about the men having chased us, the governor would use my words as weapons against us. But as I listened to Mr. Marshall speak, I felt much better. His positive attitude gave me hope that even if I couldn't speak the truth, the scales of justice were weighted on our side. I had read that he had faced up to other Southern segregationists and forced them to let my people run for office. He had also fought for equal rights for women. I felt honored that he would take the time and energy to fight for our rights. There was no doubt in my mind that if any soul on this earth could get us into Central High, this great man, Mr. Thurgood Marshall, was the one. Please stop here and answer question 4. During the meeting, the upstairs had filled with a throng of news people, most of them white, with just a sprinkling of our people. We students were directed to take our seats and to answer questions as clearly and briefly as possible. For the first time, we were introduced as the Little Rock Nine. Cameras flashed. Bright lights stung my eyes, and reporters asked lots of questions for the next half hour. Many of the reporters asked the attorneys what they planned to do to get rid of the troops, and questions were directed to Elizabeth. She seemed shy about answering, but with Mrs. Bates's help, she forced herself to say a few words. Eventually, however, questions were directed to all of us. My heart raced with fear and anticipation as I observed the process. I was almost hypnotized by the wonder of it all. Miss Patillo, how do you feel about going back to Central High? Miss, I whispered as my hands perspired and my knees shook. Thoughts buzzed inside my head like bees disturbed in their hive. It was the first time anybody white had ever called me Miss. They cared what I thought. I struggled to find a suitable answer. We have the right to go to that school, and I'm certain our governor, who is elected to govern all the people, will decide to do what is just. I felt myself speak aloud before I was ready. Who said that? It sounded like me, but the words, where did they come from? The white reporters wrote my words down and behaved as if what I said was very important. Pride welled up inside me, and for the first time I knew that working for integration was the right thing for me to be doing. Mrs. Patillo, how does a mother decide to send her daughter into such a dangerous situation? Mother Lois was sitting, shy and quiet, in a shadowed corner of the room. I could tell she was startled by the question. Nevertheless, she stood and said, "Indeed, it was a hard decision, but we are a Christian family with absolute faith that God will protect her no matter what." After the main session, reporters pulled each one of us students aside for what they called one-on-one interviews. Listening to all that talk about our being heroes and heroines made me proud of Mama and Grandma and all of us. I wish Grandma could tell the reporters how she stood guard. Then they would know she was a heroine too. When the conference broke up, I lingered in the quiet corner, soaking up the sights and sounds around me. I was fascinated by the way the reporters wrote so fast in their narrow notebooks and spoke into their handheld tape recorders. The way they responded to me made me feel quite equal to the white reporters. They looked me directly in the eye. I never saw any sign they were thinking of calling me a nigger. Some of them looked at me with admiring eyes and answered all my questions about their work without making me feel silly for asking. They also behaved as though they were genuine friends with the people of color among their ranks, sharing work and laughter. I felt a new fountain of hope rise up inside me. Just maybe, I thought to myself, just maybe this is what I want to be when I grow up. If I were a news reporter, I could be in charge of a few things. That night, I wrote in my diary, "Today is the first time in my life I felt equal to white people. I want more of that feeling. I'll do whatever I have to do to keep feeling equal all the time. I apologize, God, for thinking you had taken away all my normal life. Maybe you're just exchanging it for a new life." Please stop here and answer question 5.
Chapter 4.
Hope of settlement fades as governor faces day in court. Arkansas Gazette, Thursday, September 19th, 1957. The town was crowded with journalists from around the world. The federal court hearing would be one of the most significant in history. A precedent-setting decision could be made that affected the whole country. That's what all the news reporters and radio announcers said over and over again. States' rights advocates from surrounding southern towns were up in arms. They were headed to Little Rock to add to the incendiary feelings in our town. The segregationists were doing a lot of newspaper advertising to get people to participate in their rallies. The Arkansas National Guard remained at Central High, and hooligans rampaged through the streets. In particular, they preyed on our people walking alone in isolated areas or at night. A new level of tension crept into our own household, nearly overwhelming me. I found it difficult to study, difficult to concentrate. Some days it was as though someone had put me in Grandma's cake mixer, but I was struggling to be still, not to spin or shudder or shake. During those rare moments when I sat alone in my room among my stuffed animals, I daydreamed about Vince and what it would be like to be his ordinary girlfriend and have real dates. I had finally gathered the nerve to ask Mother and Grandmother for permission to date. After giving me what amounted to a thorough exam with really hard questions about Vince's intentions and character, Mother Lois said, "Have him come to the house." Her expression saddened as she went on. "Now, understand, this is not really dating, and you can only see this boy in the presence of another adult. I'm allowing you to do this because integration has taken away so much of your social life." I had a hard time containing my hallelujah shouts as I started to leave the room. But just as I reached the door, she said, "Of course, you'll wait to exercise this privilege until after the court hearing tomorrow." On the night before the hearing, I took Grandma's advice and let God worry about what was going to happen in the courtroom. I wrote in my diary, "Dear God, we can't get along without you. Governor Faubus has lots of attorneys, and the paper says they have more than 200 witnesses. I'm counting on you once and for all to make it clear whether you want me in that school. Thy will be done." Chapter 6. Faubus, U.S. government head into crucial collision in federal court today. Arkansas Gazette, Friday, September 20th, 1957. Sitting in my room, I couldn't stop thinking how Governor Faubus would for certain have to be in that courtroom. I couldn't imagine that he wouldn't be there. In my diary I wrote, "This is the day I hope to meet Governor Faubus face to face. I can't decide what to say to him. If only he will listen to me 1 minute. I know I can make him understand there's nothing so bad about me that he shouldn't allow white children to go to school with me." Please stop here and answer question 6. The line of us walked up the sidewalk toward the federal building at a brisk pace. Our group included Mrs. Bates, attorneys Thurgood Marshall and Wiley Brand, and a number of people I did not know. I was told there were community ministers and lawyers coming along to protect us. Between awkward scraps of conversation, I could hear our footsteps on the sidewalk as we moved toward the official-looking building. I had never paid so much attention to it before. I was a bit on edge. A small part of me was becoming accustomed to the fact that since the integration had begun, both my people and whites stared at me. Some of the faces lining the street on that morning had welcome smiles. Others were indifferent, while still others were undeniably angry. I wore dark glasses, which allowed me to peer out whenever I wanted without anybody being able to see how fearful I was. "We're going to have to take the kids in through the side door," a man's voice said. My pace quickened as we were ushered past all the people milling about through a very narrow, dimly lit marble hall where our voices and footsteps echoed. We were led to the elevator, walking fast as if we were being chased. The door slid shut and I stared straight ahead. My knees were trembling and every inch of my body was perspiring. That elevator was so full I could hear its guts grinding as it struggled to deliver us to the 4th floor courtroom. I hoped the opening elevator doors would admit fresh air. Instead, they revealed a crush of people, jammed body to body. I was blinded by the glaring lights held high over the heads of the sea of people by news photographers trying to get pictures. We could hardly get out of the elevator and into the throng. Like sardines, we wiggled and pushed, trying to forge a pathway. I stopped thinking about fresh, cool air. I just wanted to breathe and not be crushed. Please stop here and answer question 7. As we emerged, several reporters started shouting questions at us. It felt as though I was attending one of those Hollywood openings I'd seen on TV. "Smile, kids," Mrs. Bates whispered. "Straighten your shoulders, stand tall." Step by step, with enormous effort, we managed to get through the crush of human bodies. The courtroom was smaller than I imagined, about the size of an average living room, with wooden benches lining either side of a narrow aisle. I had heard someone say the courtroom held only 150 people. It was filled to overflowing. I was glad to see that a good number of the spectators were our people. Sections of the room were roped off. We were squeezed through the crowd and ushered into one of the areas in front near the bailiff. Reporters holding their notebooks sat in the jury box and in a small section near the rear of the room. As we took our seats, I noticed the United States and Arkansas flag displayed in the front of the room. "Niggers stink. This room smells now," a voice called out from somewhere behind us. I turned around to see 3 white ladies directly behind me. Suddenly, uniformed soldiers were arriving. I turned my attention away from the women heckling me as the soldiers paraded down the aisle with military precision. So these were the armed men who were keeping us away from school. These were the leaders of the Arkansas National Guard. Up close, they seemed much less intimidating. Some of them were no taller than I was. Several men and one woman, all wearing business suits and carrying briefcases, were talking to the uniformed men. I figured they were the governor's attorneys. I asked where the governor was, expecting him at any moment. That's when one of the attorneys told us that an elected official does not have to appear to answer a summons. Maybe I would not have the privilege of seeing the governor after all. I had hoped that seeing him in person would help me get over my dislike for him. Suddenly, a whisper of concern made its way through our group. We were all aware that Thelma Mothershed had a heart condition, and now, right before our eyes, her lips and fingertips were turning blue. She struggled to catch her breath. All of us focused our attention on her, and instantly I knew it was a mistake. Not only might it alarm her, but our behavior could also alert school officials to her failing health. I assumed they had never bothered to check her school records, otherwise they might have stopped her going into the integration. Please stop here and answer question 8. "Shh, Thelma will be just fine. Sit up straight. Think about what you'll say if you're called to testify." Mrs. Bates relieved our attention as she moved to sit beside Thelma. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Ronald Davies presiding." The deep voice sounded like a circus ringmaster announcing the next act. I held my breath. I had read so much about him. What would he be like? A very small man wearing a black robe entered and moved swiftly toward the massive desk. His smooth dark hair was parted in the middle, framing his pleasant round face. As he climbed up to the imposing leather chair and settled in, what stood out most of all were his huge eyes peering through thick, horn-rimmed glasses. From where I sat, I could see only the top part of his black robe, his round face, and those all-seeing, all-knowing eyes. The seats were so hard that I was pleased Judge Davies moved things along swiftly, pounding his gavel, denying motions presented by the governor's attorneys, all the while speaking sternly. Finally, just before noon, one of the attorneys, Tom Harper, speaking for Governor Faubus, asked if preliminary matters were taken care of. "Well," the judge growled, "I haven't gotten the late mail, but I think so." Continuing in a matter-of-fact tone, Harper then asked Judge Davies to dismiss the case because it involved constitutional issues that required a 3-judge panel. Judge Davies ruled that the case would continue. In response to that ruling, Harper said, "May we be excused?" Judge Davies spoke emphatically. "You are excused, gentlemen, but you understand that this is a moot question. The hearing will proceed." Harper began reading a statement. "The position of Governor Faubus and the military officials of the state is that the governor in the state will not concede that the U.S. court or anyone else can question the authority of the governor to exercise his judgment in administering the affairs of states. And since he does not concede this responsibility, we will not proceed further in this action." To my amazement, Harper led the way as several men and one woman gathered their papers and followed him out the door. "Is this a protest?" someone asked. Reporters ran for the door like corralled horses through an open gate. I thought they'd hurt themselves. The judge pounded the gavel. Please stop here and answer question 9. The attorneys for the Department of Justice called themselves amicus curiae, saying they were prepared to offer more than 100 witnesses to support the order for integration. Word was whispered down our line that amicus curiae meant friend to the court. But surely no real friend would keep us sitting on those hard seats long enough for 100 people to testify. My heart sank as we 9 eyeballed one another with grim expressions. "We'll be too old for high school if we have to listen to all those people," I whispered out loud. To my delight, the judge announced that 100 witnesses would not begin until after lunch. In order to get our lunch, we walked through a gauntlet of hot, flashing lights and squeezed past people shouting questions. Once outside, we encountered the problem that had always plagued our people in Little Rock. There were no restaurants that would serve us, at least no decent ones. The mighty Thurgood Marshall was forced to join us in a greasy joint that served wilted lettuce on overcooked hamburgers in the shabby section of our neighborhood known as 9th Street. As he ate, he answered our questions. More than anything, he seemed to be astonished that the governor's attorneys had walked out of the room so suddenly. "It must have been their plan all along," he said. That afternoon, the parade of witnesses presented by the Justice Department made one major point. They said the threat of violence due to integration was not sufficient for the governor to have called our troops. School Superintendent Virgil Blossom testified for a long time about the details of the school board's plan for integration, which had taken 2 years and 200 meetings to devise. How were these 9 students chosen? The Negroes were selected on the basis of scholarship, personal conduct, and health. We picked those who had the mental ability to do the job and had used it. Blossom answered. For just a moment, I fretted they would discover Thelma's secret heart problem, but the fact was they had never had us examined by a doctor, and there was no talk of doing so. Then it came time to present our case. First to testify from our group was Ernest Green. He wanted to go to Central, he said, because it was closer to his home and would save time and money. He was asked whether he offered any assault against the troops. "No, sir, I didn't," he said with a broad smile. Next, Elizabeth Eckford testified. She did not complain about the life-threatening mob that had traumatized her. She sat erect, speaking calmly, saying that a few white people lived not far from her house, yet there had been no racial disputes. I was relieved when the attorney said that there would be no need for the rest of us to testify. The attorneys for the United States made repeated references to the May 1954 decision. I had to stop listening. The very mention of that decision always made me sad. It brought back the face of the angry white man that had chased me down that day. Panic-filled recollections flooded my mind, blotting out the courtroom proceedings. "Melba! Melba!" Minnie was tugging at my arm. The others were excited. The judge was announcing his decision, saying that the governor had thwarted the court-approved plan of integration by means of National Guard troops. The judge's voice was deep, his tone emphatic, as he said, "There is no real evidence here that we shouldn't proceed with the court-ordered integration of Central High School. The order is so entered." He pounded the gavel, stood, and walked out of the room. "Oh, damn nigger-loving judge," someone shouted, using all those words that Grandma had said would lead a body to hell. Mrs. Bates told us to remain seated until everyone else left the room. I sat very still for a long moment as everybody around me began moving. So, God, you really do want me to go back to that school. For a time it seemed as if I were all alone in a silent tunnel and everyone else was way at the other end. I'd always remember that judge and his huge, piercing dark eyes. There must be something wonderful in his heart, I thought. I would remember him in my prayers. "Come Monday morning, you'll be a giant Central High student. How do you feel about that?" One of the reporters shouted his question above all others. "Monday morning," I whispered. "I'm going to be a Central High student. Monday morning." Please stop here and answer question 10.